Just before 10 at night on the 21st of August 1986, a low rumble rolled across the hills of northwestern Cameroon. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. By morning, 1,746 people were dead, along with every cow, every bird, even the insects across 16 miles of countryside. Nothing was burned, nothing was flooded, not a single building was damaged. The killer was the lake itself. That night, Lake Nyos exhaled, a cloud of invisible gas that had been building beneath the water for centuries. It had happened before. A scientist had tried to warn the world and been told he was being ridiculous. And in another lake, far bigger, it is building again. The Calamity Files. The highlands of northwestern Cameroon are green, cool, and beautiful. A landscape of terraced farms, cattle herds, and small villages scattered through deep valleys. The people here were farmers and herders. Life was hard, but the land was generous. And at the heart of it lay Lake Nyos, a deep blue crater lake, barely a mile across, resting in the throat of an old volcano. Locals called the area around it good land. Some elders, though, told older stories of lakes in these mountains that could rise, move, and kill. Science would later explain what the legends remembered. Lake Nyos is more than 600 feet deep, and it sits on a chain of volcanoes. Far below the lake bed, magma releases carbon dioxide, which seeps up through the rock and dissolves into the deepest water. Under the crushing pressure of the water above, the gas simply stays there, building, year after year, century after century. The lake had become a bottle of soda the size of a valley, shaken, saturated, and sealed by nothing but its own weight. All it needed was someone or something to open it. And 2 years before Nyos, 60 miles away, something already had. At a lake almost no one outside Cameroon would ever hear about. In August of 1984 at Lake Nyos, 60 miles to the south, a truck full of passengers stopped on the road before dawn in a strange white mist. 37 people died there at the edge of the water with no wounds and no explanation. The government, fearing panic and rumors of sabotage, kept it quiet, but one scientist would not let it go. An Icelandic volcanologist named Haraldur Sigurdsson traveled to Nyos, tested the water, and reached a conclusion that sounded like science fiction. The lake itself had erupted, not with lava, but with gas. Carbon dioxide built up in the depths for centuries had burst out in a suffocating wave. He wrote it up, calling it a hitherto unknown natural hazard that could wipe out whole towns. And in early 1986, he submitted it to the journal Science. Science rejected the paper. The idea was too far-fetched, so the warning stayed buried in a drawer. While 60 miles north, 5,000 people slept in the valleys below a nearly identical lake called Nyos, and that lake kept filling. His paper would be vindicated in the most horrifying way possible within months. August 21st, 1986 was a market day. That evening, the villages around Lake Nyos, Nyos itself, Cha, Kam, and Subum, 16 miles down the valley, settled in early. It was the rainy season. The night was cool and still, and families gathered around oil lamps and cooking fires. In Subum, a man named Joseph Nkwain went to bed in a house full of his family, his young daughter asleep nearby. It was, by every account, an utterly ordinary night. Remember him. He is one of the few who will live to tell us what the next hour felt like from the inside. Above the villages, the lake lay flat and black under the clouds. Deep below the surface, the water was holding hundreds of thousands of tons of dissolved carbon dioxide. Close to full saturation, something disturbed it that night. A rock slide into the water, perhaps, or cold rain sinking through the layers. To this day, nobody knows for certain. At around 9:30, the bottle opened. Deep water, suddenly rising, began to fizz, and once it started, it could not stop. A column of water and foaming gas burst from the surface, hundreds of feet into the night sky. A wave over 80 feet high slammed into the southern shore, stripping the hillside bare. And then the lake went quiet again, because the real weapon was already moving. Carbon dioxide is invisible and half again heavier than air. It does not blow away. It flows like water downhill. A cloud, perhaps 150 feet thick, poured over the crater rim and split into the valleys below, moving as fast as 40 miles an hour. There was no outrunning it. There was no smelling it coming. It filled each valley like a flood with no water. In the village of Nyos, closest to the lake, people collapsed where they stood, mid-sentence, mid-step. Lamps kept burning in houses where every heartbeat had stopped. Of hundreds of residents, only a handful survived. The cloud rolled on, through Cha, through Calm, into Subum. Some people woke, felt a strange warmth, smelled what they thought was gunpowder or rotten eggs. A trick the gas plays on the human brain, and stood up. Standing was fatal. The gas was deepest near the ground, but rising took effort, and effort took oxygen no one had. In Subum, Joseph Nkwain heard his daughter breathing strangely in the dark and tried to reach her bed. In his own words years later, "I could not speak, I became unconscious." The gas took him mid-step on the floor of his own home, reaching for his child. Whether he or she would wake again, the morning would decide. The survivors woke into silence, some after 6 hours, some after a day and a half. No bird song, no insects, no cattle lowing. Whole families lay as if asleep. Joseph Nkwain woke on his floor the next morning, weak and confused, and alive. His daughter and much of his family did not. He would spend the rest of his life as one of the witnesses history needed, proof in a human voice of what the lake had done. Some 4,000 people fled the region on foot, many gasping, some collapsing on the way. Helicopters arriving days later found villages intact and utterly still, and more than 3,000 dead cattle scattered across the hills. And the lake itself had changed. The deep blue water had turned a rusty, bloody red, iron dragged up from the depths, rusting in the open air. To the outside world, it looked like the scene of an impossible crime. And that is exactly how scientists treated it. Investigators from a dozen countries descended on the valley. The first theories were dark: an epidemic, a chemical spill, even a secret weapon. But the evidence refused to cooperate. No toxins, no burns, no disease. The pathology pointed to one absurdly ordinary killer: carbon dioxide, the same gas in every bottle of soda in unimaginable quantity. Water samples settled it. The deep lake was still loaded with dissolved gas. Bottles raised from the bottom foamed over like champagne. Lake Nyos had been the rehearsal. Lake Nyos was the performance, and the Icelandic volcanologist whose paper had been called far-fetched. He was vindicated overnight, in the cruelest way a scientist ever can be. The hazard he had described in a rejected manuscript had just killed 1,746 people, exactly as he'd warned. Nature had pulled the trigger, but silence had loaded the gun, and the scientist's final finding was worse than the disaster itself. The lake was still recharging. Left alone, it would do this all over again. The fix took 15 years to fund, and it is beautifully simple. In 2001, engineers sank a pipe into the deepest water. The rising gas powers its own fountain, a permanent controlled eruption, a lake slowly exhaling in safety. 2 more pipes followed a decade later. Lake Nyos and Lake Nyos have been largely diffused. But 800 miles to the southeast lies Lake Kivu, 1,000 times larger, loaded with carbon dioxide and methane. and along its shores live not 5,000 people but more than 2 million. Scientists watch it constantly. The lesson of Nyos is carved into every one of those measurements. The warning only matters if someone listens. Nyos was a disaster nature built in secret, but some disasters are built by people who were warned to their faces. Like the millionaires who kept a private lake above a steel city until the day it fell on them. If you haven't seen the Johnstown file, it's already open. It's on screen now.